Riding a Century is a big deal in the world of road cycling, arguably the thing, the benchmark distance to which we all try to hit at least once in our riding lives. Even the most experienced cyclists among us can't hide the satisfaction of hitting 100 miles in the saddle. But unfortunately, riding 100 miles is not as easy as just riding a bike. There's plenty of planning and prep that needs to go into it before the big day. So in today's video, whether you're a new cyclist planning that first Century ride or a more experienced rider who's just after some sound advice, we've compiled our top tips and tricks for how to ride your first 100 miles. Okay, so before you even consider swinging a leg over the bike and trying to ride a Century, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of planning and prep that needs to go in before the big day. The first thing is choosing a time and a date. One way that you could approach this is by entering an organised event, a Grand Fondo or Sportif like the Dragon Ride in Wales or Ride London in England. That concrete day in the diary to aim at will make things a lot easier in terms of logistics. Alternatively, you could just forego an organised event for something that you have complete control over yourself. If you are doing that, what we then suggest doing is looking at something like a long weather forecast. Why do you want to look at a weather forecast? Well, if it's your first 6, 7, 8 hour day in the saddle, you don't want to be doing it in pouring rain, howling winds, or even icy conditions. And on the flip side of that, while today's a lovely day, you don't want to be doing it in really warm conditions either, as that can be just as hard as riding in the cold. The next thing on your tick list is going to be route. Now what you could do is you could get on your bike, ride 50 miles in one direction, turn around and ride 50 miles home. But while you will be making life harder for yourself, you may also find it quite the mundane experience too. What we suggest is that you use one of the great mapping apps such as Komoot, Strava, Ride With My GPS to pre-plan and follow your route for the big day. Now, in terms of route, you want to be able to do something and plan out a route that you know you'll be capable of riding. Hills are fun, but ultimately quite hard, and 100 miles on flatter terrain is going to make your life a lot easier, especially if the big goal is just riding that Century. So when planning out your route, we suggest trying to stick to roads that you know and you've ridden before. Speaking from personal experience, you don't want to be turning a corner at mile 80, hitting a 20% climb you never knew existed. Like me, you might find yourself having to get off the bike and walk to the top, which is not an experience we suggest you want to share. If you can't stick to roads that you've done before, what we do suggest is that you go onto Google Street View or Google Maps prior to the ride for a little reconnaissance. That way you'll be able to check the road for in terms of its surface and whether it's suitable for your road bike, and get a judge on how busy it is in terms of traffic and whether you'll be contending with too many cars. And finally, in terms of route planning, try and find yourself a nice cafe or a shop at the 50 to 60 mile mark. Having that sort of aim at halfway where you know you'll be able to fill up your bottles, stop for some food and have a little bit of a rest before the second half of the ride will help break down that 100-mile distance into much more manageable chunks. So you found that day in the calendar, or you've booked yourself into a Sportif and you spent hours of your life on Google Maps assessing the route. You're all good to go. Well, unfortunately not, because riding 100 miles on the bike is actually quite hard, and therefore you need to put a bit of effort in on the bike before the big day. Luckily, it's not as much effort and hard work as you may believe. Now, some may say that you want to do a training program or a structured ride plan before doing 100 miles, but we say you can keep it much simpler than that. What we suggest is by starting by commuting to work. Now, if commuting to work isn't an option, how about an hour or two a day before work or after work on the turbo or out on the roads as a good base? Once you've got that base in place, you'll have the weekends for longer rides, and that's when you can really start building up the miles towards 100. Now, we suggest starting with a 2-hour ride. If that 2-hour ride's too much, maybe do an hour and a half, but use that as your first weekend's ride and see how you feel. If that goes well, the next week on, add on half an hour. Don't worry about distance, just add on half an hour in the saddle. With every weekend that passes, we suggest adding on an extra half an hour with every ride, not worrying about distance. Before you know it, you'll be doing 4.5, 5, 6 hours in the saddle and getting ever closer to that 100-mile mark. So our next set of tips revolve around kit and equipment. Starting with clothing, every cyclist that you speak to will have their own opinion in terms of what clothing you need to wear on a 100-mile bike ride. And ideally, it's completely dependent off of weather and what you feel comfortable in. But for us here at Cyclist, we will suggest that there are two pieces of clothing that are completely non-negotiable on any Century ride. The first piece of clothing is the packable gilet. So I've got one here from our friends at Void. 9 times out of 10, you will not need this. It'll be folded up into a very small ball in your back pocket and you'll completely forget it's there. But on the one occasion that you do need it, it can become a true lifesaver. If the weather turns and it starts to rain, it can help keep you dry. It won't keep you completely waterproof, but it will keep the brunt of it away from you. If the temperature drops, it's a great little thin piece of material that can help you keep a little bit warmer. And if the wind picks up or you go down a very long, fast, winding descent, this can be the perfect thing from keeping the chill from your chest, which again will help keep you warm, but also prevent you from potentially getting sick. The second piece of clothing that we suggest you always wear on a long ride, or any ride for that matter, is the base layer. I've got a lovely pink one on here from Rapha, and the base layer comes in many shapes and sizes and forms, but they all essentially do the same thing. It's a thin piece of material that you wear underneath your bib straps and your jersey that will, one, help you keep warm, but mainly help wick sweat away from the body. And in doing that, it will help moderate your body temperature, meaning that you don't get too cold or too warm, and keep you comfortable for long days in the saddle. Oh, and on the base layer, last thing, because it's underneath your bib straps and underneath the jersey, if you've got an uncomfortable jersey or experience chafing from the straps, the base layer should also help to alleviate that too. So moving on from clothing to equipment, let's talk about tools. Now, if you speak to some of my colleagues at Cyclist, they'd advise that you took your entire toolbox on every ride that you went on. But for me, I like to keep it simple. And by simple, I mean 2 inner tubes, minimum, set of tyre levers, a nice multi-tool, and a mini pump. Some people do take CO2 canisters, but I prefer the mini pump. Chances are, if you're a novice to cycling and you're doing your first Century ride and you have a mechanical that needs more than inner tubes, a tyre leader, multi-tool and a pump, you probably won't be able to fix it anyway and will have to get a cab home or get someone to come pick you up. But with these simple tools here, you should be able to keep going in case of stuff like punctures or issues with your brakes. Moving on from tools, last one is lotions. And I think you're probably thinking, lotions, what does he mean by that? By that, I mean SPF, sun lotion and chamois cream. Starting with sun lotion, I've got a SPF 20 here, but ideally, if you're doing a 5, 6, 7 hour day in the saddle, you'll probably want an SPF 50. You won't have time or you won't have the ability to stop and put on and reapply suntan lotion during the day, so the higher the factor SPF you put on, the more protection you'll have throughout the day. Moving on from the suntan lotion, we recommend using some chamois cream as well, both for hygiene and comfort reasons. You may think, do I need to use chamois cream? Use it. In the long run, you'll thank us. Okay, so our next set of tips are going to revolve around fueling. Like a car, our body needs fuel to move, and if you plan to move for 100 miles on a bicycle, you are going to need to fuel correctly. Now, ideally, fueling for a big bike ride actually starts the night before and the morning of the ride. The night before, you want to be treating yourself to a nice big carb-based meal, something like pasta or chili, and then the morning of your ride, you want to be eating something that's ideally slow burning, something like porridge. Then, when it comes to the actual bike ride, there is plenty of science around how you should be and why you should be fueling correctly. But to be honest, that science bores me no end, so I'm going to keep it nice and simple and say all you need to do is eat little and often. So from the moment you start riding, realistically, you want to be eating every 45 minutes. Now, I know what you think. I've just had a big breakfast and a big dinner. Why do I need to start eating 45 minutes into the ride? Well, think in the future when you're 5, 6 hours into that ride, you'll be sort of benefiting from the fact that you started eating earlier and not having to pull into any of the sort of energy reserves that you ultimately don't need to. When you're on the bike, we also say stick to carb-based sort of solid foods, stuff like sandwiches, bananas, energy bars, as they are much easier to digest, plus they're also a lot easier to sort of handle while on the bike. Our other big tip about sort of the food on the bike is to stay savoury and to stay solid for as long as possible. So what we mean by that is sort of sticking to stuff like these energy bars from Naked, Cliff Bars, rice cakes earlier on. They're much more easy to digest and sort of easier to consume. And then moving on to the gels later on in the ride. If you do 6-7 hours just on energy gels, that amount of sugar will probably make you feel a little bit sick quite soon. Furthermore, when you do stop halfway through your ride, end up somewhere like here, the Kemsing Italian Deli, get yourself a delicious sandwich or something savoury rather than that piece of cake, as again, that sweet stuff will sort of build up in your tummy and make it harder sort of you to get through the ride. Lastly, we also say stay away from fatty foods. Fatty foods are notoriously hard to digest, and if you're eating fatty foods for 6-7 hours while on the bike, chances are you'll start to feel bloated and a little bit sick too. So on the actual day of the ride, alongside fueling, the most important thing is going to be pacing. Now, you don't want to go out too hard and find yourself running out of energy and not being able to get home. Likewise, you don't want to go out too easy and find yourself getting home after dark. You want to go at a level that you know you can sustain for 100 miles. Now, unless you've got data like a heart rate or power meter, you can do a pretty simple way of judging this, which is basically being able to talk to your riding partner but feeling like you're just about to run out of breath. Now, that doesn't feel very scientific, but it's worked for us in the past. And you want to take that onto the climbs as well. Traditionally, we say attack the climbs, try and set a good time, try and get a PB, but this ride's about riding 100 miles rather than riding uphill very fast. So, if that's the case, taking an easy level to that climb so you know you'll be able to get home. And for our last tip, make sure you have fun. Enjoy yourself while out on the bike. After all, that's what it's all about. Cycling is not just a masochistic ritual by which we use to suffer. So when you're out there riding your first century, make sure you take in your surroundings, enjoy yourself, stop, take some photos. When you pull up for that coffee, tea, piece of cake or sandwich, make sure you enjoy it. If you're riding with someone else, cherish their company, and if you're on your own, just enjoy the peace and quiet. But predominantly, just make sure you have some fun while out on the bike. And of course, if you are riding your first century, I wish you good luck. If you found this video helpful, make sure that you give it a like, and if you know someone who's planning on riding their first century soon, be sure to share this video with them too. And if you'd like more from the Cyclist team, including some how-tos, reviews and tech tutorials, subscribe to our YouTube page below.